Jeremy has said it in the very beginning about formalities. Now we have a mind-blowing amount of academic titles here with us. So we have decided that we address each other on a first-name basis to make it as informal as possible. Now, before I give the word to the two new speakers on the panel, I would just like to briefly set the frame of our discussion. We do not want to discuss the question of whether climate change is a fact or not, whether it is man-made or not. We could fill a week discussing only that, of course. Now, what I would like to kind of define the field of our discussion is by actually quoting from a paper that Konrad Hummler has published last year, The End of the Commons, and I think he has beautifully kind of defined the broad consensus that we have in our societies today, which is, I quote, "Yes, climate change is a fact. Yes, it is probably primarily caused by the proliferation, the lifestyle, and the behavior of the human species. Yes, we must act to slow, halt, or even reverse these developments. The questions of how quickly, by what methods, and at what costs, this is where the big divergence happen, and this is where we want to discuss kind of the how not, the costs, who should bear the costs, and what paths are the most promising. Now we know, obviously, this is an issue of decision-making under uncertainty. And we know it's a time of compulsion, of upheaval, which absolutely means that there is the possibility, the danger of malinvestment. There is the danger of, and I also quote Konrad here, of taking pseudo and not real solutions. And of course, there's the danger that decisions will be moralized. And we try to be as neutral, as fact-based when we discuss here on stage. Now, having given this framework, I'll just briefly introduce the two new faces on the podium. First, to my near left, Professor Annalisa Manera. She's a professor of nuclear systems and multiphase flows at the ETH here in Zurich. Since July 2021, she's on a leave of absence from the University of Michigan, where for 10 years she has been a professor in the nuclear engineering department. And then on her left, we have Konrad Hummler. I don't need to introduce him. He's the founder and partner of M1 and the vice president of the Progress Foundation. Now, I've invited the two new speakers to just briefly share with us for 3 to 4 minutes, because we have a very broad outline from both Jeremy and Lino. Give us your key thoughts on the topic of our discussion of energy and climate, from wishful thinking to realistic action. Annalisa first.
Yeah, thank you for your introduction. Yes, I'm an engineer, so I also like, as Professor Guzzella, to do very practical example, right? And so we discussed about electricity and energy, right? And one thing, for example, that I just noticed today is that there is Swiss Airlines, for example, has 2 flights a day from Zurich to Chicago, among others, right? And if we are looking, for example, at the numbers of Syntellion, so the company that is now building pilot solar plant for the production of synthetic fuel for flights, and they have a contract with Swiss Airlines. They would need the equivalent of 3 gondola just for these 2 flights a day from Zurich to Chicago, one way. This just to mention, how big the problem of energy and electricity is only just in Switzerland. So nuclear power plants in Switzerland last year, they produced more than 40% of the electricity for the 5 winter months. And so we are actually looking at a very large amount of energy and electricity, and when we are looking at this scenario, right, the question that I ask always myself is, yes, on an Excel sheet everything works, but in practice, can we really install the equivalent of 1,000 gondola just to replace the nuclear power plants, without considering batteries and everything else, and without considering the energy? And can we afford to actually eliminate some of the options, like nuclear, that we have seen at work, as worked, not only for Switzerland, but for many other countries. So if you are looking actually in the history of decarbonization, all countries that have managed the largest amount of decarbonization, including Switzerland, because Switzerland has a CO2, basically CO2-free electricity production, they all managed within 10 years, and they all managed within, with a massive support of nuclear energy.
Thank you. And by the way, we have a great new unit of calculation: one Gondelsolar and one Gösgen. So we all know what we're talking about. Thank you, Annalisa. Konrad, you're next.
Well, I tried to actually come up with a kind of framework which is based on the economic theory to define how a market could be actually organized or installed or whatever, or arises somehow, which allows to price CO2 more or less in a way which makes sense in terms of a market. Now, the economics has actually a framework. It looks at the atmosphere as a sort of a commons, and there is a big theory about the tragedy of the commons. There is the framework of Ronald Coase, of course, of externalities and internalizing externalities and so on. So actually the theoretical work has been done, and in a way we have actually only to use this theory to come up with something like a marketplace for CO2. And that was the question, and that you can find in this little booklet which was published last year. And actually I can give you some good news. You know, first of all, the thoughts have been there and the theory is there, so that's already good. It's possible to have kind of market solutions, and instead of state solutions which are always kind of rationing and things like that. The good news is that these commons can be reduced because the information and transaction costs went down dramatically over the last years. So, which means that in a way we can internalize what is now externalized to the atmosphere as a commons can be technically internalized. So you will find kind of property rights which can be related to people who produce CO2 or to people who actually absorb CO2, and that's actually the question. The question is how to balance CO2 emissions and absorption. And in a way, what we don't see right now is that absorbers get money for what they are doing. So forests, holders of forests, of trees, and so on, but perhaps in a way also technical absorbers. So in a way, this is one good news, the reduction of information and transaction costs. And the second good news is that actually, I think with not so much regulation, one could organize a marketplace for CO2 emissions. There's one condition: you need kind of a territory which is defined, and on this territory people must say, we want to have this or that amount of CO2 given to the atmosphere or not. This level has to be defined. That's the first condition. And there is one restriction: importing goods to this territory from non-compliant countries must actually have a kind of implied toll or whatever. So it has to be there has to be a premium for that. And then here you will find also a recommendation. We would recommend not to tax or to price the end consumer, but we would actually tend to price whenever CO2 potential is produced somehow, somewhere, then it should be taxed actually in a way as a withholding tax system, and it goes with the products to the consumption, so still we have some freedom of how we use and how we produce and how much we produce CO2. So that's actually what has been done by Progress Foundation over the last couple of months or years.
Thank you, Konrad. We get into the economic questions and also of who bears the costs in the second half of our discussion. Maybe just to start, I'd like to discuss the question a bit of what speed should we take and what means are the best to get there. And also for that, I'd like to quote from the World Energy Pulse report that was published in April of this year by the World Energy Council, which is a survey of 711 leaders in the energy decision makers, let's say it that way. And a clear majority of them, 64%, they said they are worried that we are too slow in driving the energy transition. First question to Lino, would you agree with that? Do we have to accept that we are moving too slowly right now on a world basis?
If you say we are moving too slow, then you have to find first the reference basis. What would be the right speed?
The question was...
that's exactly the question that everybody avoids. And that's sorry, I don't want to be rude.
No,
but I've heard these questions over and over again. We're too small, we're slow, we need to do more. Right, okay.
Maybe just to define, the question was asked, are we moving at the right speed to meet the goals that were set at the Paris Climate Agreement? That was that.
No, because these goals are completely unrealistic. I mean, I can always say, I need to cure cancer by 2050. We need to cure cancer by 2050. We're moving too slow. We need to put more research money. We need to do more for that. This is not a meaningful problem set that you have. If you define unrealistic goal, then whatever you do, it will always be too slow. And by that, you then create these circles, viciosos, where you want to put more pressure, and then at the end of the day, it's always boils down to political pressure. You want to force people to do something. No, I do not accept that the 2050 goal is the right one, because it is technically, which is not so difficult, scientifically, but it is economically and also politically not feasible. He said it. If we try really to push that hard, we will need very, very dictatorial political systems, and the ones who will be punished most will be the poor people. I cannot say it differently. The rich one will always find solutions to fuel their jets with some sustainable airline fuels. That's not the issue. This is a completely unrealistic assumption that by 2050 we will reach that goal. And then, of course, we're too slow. If I want to jump to meet the 50 by 2030, and I'm not on a good path to reach that Olympic medal, I'm sorry, I'm too slow. I need to do more. I have to say goodbye now and go training. You see the kind of reasoning that is behind it. It really makes me a little bit, as you noticed, mad.
Jeremy, would you agree with the statement that the goals that were set are completely unrealistic, and therefore, of course, we're on a path that is too slow?
I'm going to partially agree,
okay,
and then nuance some things, because just a bit of history. I was the founding CEO of Shell Hydrogen in 2020, and I produced Shell's first scenarios that I was responsible for in 2006, which is a date I mentioned earlier. And at that time, I said the decisions in the next 5 years are critical. And I've been saying that ever since, because the pace of decision-making has been too slow to meet the kinds of aspirations global society have had. In fact, what's interesting is that those early scenarios, one explored the most accelerated type of outlook you could explore, and one the most sluggish. And I can now look back 15 years or more to see that the socio-political aspects have been like the scramble scenario, i.e. the most sluggish, but the techno-economic developments on things like solar, offshore wind, battery electric vehicles have been towards the more optimistic side. So things have changed, but they are not changing yet quickly enough to meet those aspirations, which is why I showed at that chart with different scenarios. There was only one of those scenarios that met the aspirations. So it is technically still feasible to meet those. I worry that the socio-political elements of achieving that will not be able to be taken quickly enough. And it's one of the reasons why I'm also a champion for looking at the carrots as well as the sticks. The sticks are necessary, but look at the carrots.
i.e. incentives and things like that.
Yeah, the incentives, and the incentives that people don't recognize. I mean, you saw from your graph, Lino, the effective CO2 cost of changing from an internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle. And yet there are a lot of people doing that. And they originally didn't do it because of CO2. They did it because it was really cool to be a dude in California and show off your computer on wheels. And that feeds through, and that has stimulated battery developments and driven down battery costs. So we have to shift our mindset a little bit from only seeing costs and also seeing opportunities. So that's the nuance I would say. So I agree with you that the plausibility of achieving the Paris goals has become very small. It's small, but our mindsets are still locked into ways that will keep it moving too slowly. Whereas if we can also recognize that even, as you say, with markets, there are incentives, that you need to look at the carrots as well as the sticks, and the carrots are being underappreciated.
Konrad.
Well, I'm actually much more optimistic about the social-political aspect because of the information and transaction costs, which are actually, they go towards zero. And this means that things which were commons in the past will get internalized. They have to, they will, that will happen. It will be interesting to have actually the atmosphere as a marketplace. And there, of course, I agree with you that there are huge incentives, because in a world where you can deal with CO2 on both sides, actually producing it and absorbing it, in a way, this is a huge market. I mean, my goodness, that will be interesting also to have options and futures on that.
Yeah, and on the socio-political side, that needs to be captured better than it is done. They talk about Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. One of the things that most people don't recognize is just, for instance, how valuable the soil resource is for containing and absorbing carbon dioxide. But if you're going to create a market around that, there's a lot of issues about verification and monitoring and all those kinds of issues. But it is there.
But take Google Earth. With Google Earth, you can define everything on the soil, Yeah. And that's the interesting thing. And that's information and transaction costs.
Annalisa, we've talked about the question of the speed that we're moving at. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that first, and also then, I mean, you made quite a passionate statement about nuclear energy in your introductory remarks, but what, in your view, are the most promising paths to take that really move the needle?
Yes, first I would like to continue on what Professor Guzzella has mentioned, actually, because again, I mean, as an engineer, I really like numbers, and also I like reality, right? So when we talk about energy scenarios, those are not prediction. This is just if-what statements. If elephant can fly, then this reality will happen, right? And with the energy scenario, it's exactly the same. So if you're looking now at Switzerland, according to the BFS scenario, we need 12 terawatt-hour per year solar by the next 8 years. If we are looking at, actually by 2030, so earlier. If we look at what's happening in practice, Axpo has just announced that they will spend 1.5 billion francs for the next 10 years, and they will install 1.5 terawatt-hour, but we need 12, right? So where are the other 9 Axpo companies in Switzerland that will do the same if they manage? By 2050, the things get even more interesting, because by 2050, according to the BFS scenario, we should install the equivalent of more than 1,400 gondola solar in Switzerland. And we have just seen the vote of last week about Alpine Solar. And if one checks the Alpic website about their gondola solar, because that's their power plant, they mention that this plant will be only profitable if they get at least 60% subvention from the state. But we don't have one. We want to install the equivalent of 1,400. So I agree with Professor Guzzella. If we put our goals to be so unrealistic, there is no way of speed that we will ever fulfill this goal. We can accelerate by a factor 10, and we will still not manage. Okay.
You would say the only way to get even close would be
to consider other technology, of course, yes.
Nuclear.
Well, nuclear is one of them. And if we look at, for example, what happened, I'll take the very latest example. So South Korea, in the last 9 years, they have installed in the Emirates, the land of sun and oil, 4 nuclear power plants. 3 are already in operation. The last one will get in operation by next year. And when they will be done, they will produce more than 40 terawatt-hour per year of electricity. So this is actually almost double what our Swiss plant do, right? So just that to mention that, and they did this in 9 years, right? So if there is a will, we combine all solutions we have, right? Then we can do it, right?
I mean, Lino, you also pretty much showed us the folly of solar power projects or dreaming in Switzerland. If I understood you correctly, the only way, and you showed sort of the number of deaths and the CO2 intensity, you would say nuclear should have a much more prominent role in our discussion here in Switzerland than it has today. Would you agree with that?
You know, the privilege of being a retired professor is you don't have to give any recommendations anymore. This is you guys to decide. This is a political question. You can put on sunroofs on your solar panels on your roofs. You can do gondola solar. You can do nuclear power plants. You can just cut eating meat. I don't care. What I care about, in which I've been very vocal, is when you start lying. When you start claiming things that are against the first 2 principles of thermodynamics. Huh? And the first one everybody understands. It is from nix kommt nix. When you violate energy balances, when you simply do not consider the fundamentals, then I have the privilege as an older man, white man, more or less, to say, sorry guys, that won't work. Do whatever you want, but please don't start telling stories that simply are not true. And the Swiss energy strategy as it stands, the only one, it's rather old because in the meantime the parliament has made many decisions, Mantlerlast, blah, blah, blah. But all of these, if you have looked carefully at it, are only piecemeal, Stückwerk. They just look at one thing and the other thing. I haven't seen since 2017 a comprehensive energy strategy anymore. So I asking the Swiss government and our society to come up with a new, revised, comprehensive energy strategy that tells me how they want to reach these ambition goals. I tell them the old one that you showed won't work. And I'm repeating myself, I know. Please come and prove me wrong. I would be so happy. And this is at least 10, 15 years that I'm telling this message. Nobody has stepped up to the podium and proved me wrong. I'm waiting. Come on.
Now, when we
I'm not giving an answer to your question. I do not recommend anything. But if you look at the numbers and then you hear what the options are, you might come and think of yourself of some solutions.
Now, obviously, when we talk about combating climate change, it boils down to trying to get less carbon into the atmosphere. One can do that by reducing the carbon intensity of energy production. One could also do it by reducing the energy intensity of the economy, right? Of the various paths, Jeremy, that we talk about in our societies today, solar, we should do more wind, we should do more hydrogen, and so on. What are the paths that you find most promising, where we should put more emphasis on?
Very interesting question. And so I'm just going to go one step before that and then into that to try and respond to it. So first of all, something that should be obvious to everyone, but it is worth just kind of reiterating, is that we can't do, build, or move anything without energy. So energy is so deeply integrated into everything. Our economies, but also the needs of the economies where billions of people still suffer poor qualities of life. And if you actually look at how we use energy, you find that a lot of it is required in those heavy areas of constructing new cities, building factories. And so a lot of those emerging economies are going through the most energy-intensive phases of development right now. And so here in Zurich, largely, I guess, a service economy, growing economy here doesn't necessarily add much energy need. But growing the economy in sub-Saharan Africa brings huge energy needs. So one of the things I think that gets overlooked is not necessarily a pathway, and we can talk about pathways, I've got views on pathways, but if you remember that chart where I showed that big potential impact of energy efficiency, well, a lot of that comes from investing in compact rather than sprawling cities, in integrated heat, water, power, waste systems, in integrated public transport, private transport systems. And so I think that gets kind of overlooked, and I think that it shouldn't be, and there should be much more focus on that element of the pathway. And then on the technical side, I think that this huge electrification of the economy with non-fossil sources, wind, solar, nuclear, is very key. I think that the biofuels area for liquid fuels is key. And I think that the hydrogen economy for gaseous fuels is key.
Now, every roughly 20 years or so, the media, and I say this as a member of the media, gets into a frenzy when some cold fusion project shows a success. And it's kind of always treated as, this might be the silver bullet that solves all problems. Annalisa, what are your thoughts on nuclear fusion?
Yeah, research in nuclear fusion is very important. However, nuclear fusion is not a solution that will come for our 2050 energy scenario, and I can actually quantify it. There is the so-called Q factor that we use in nuclear fusion, which is basically the ratio between the energy that we get out from the fusion reaction and the energy that we put in, right? And now the issue is that right now this ratio is below 1. Even when we consider the energy that we just put in the fuel, so not the energy that we put in the machine, that is 100 times more than that, right? So basically, we can make this ratio, so it's 0.0. So that's just to tell that we are decades away from a working fusion, and then after that, now we are talking about the physics, right? After that, they come all the engineering challenges. If we're talking about fission, for example, which is much simpler, it's order of magnitude simpler physics than fusion. And still, the first working reactor was with Fermi in 1942, and it took 20 years to then get to the commercialization, to real power plants, right, that we can attach to the network. So now, we can think about the same for fusion, even if the engineering is much more complicated, right? So from having a working prototype that we don't have, we will still have decades to have a working engineering power plant. Right?
So this is something more towards the end of the century that might get interesting at some point, but definitely not something that should be treated as a silver bullet in the next few decades.
First that, right. And then the second thing I would actually like to add, and that I actually mentioned it many times, if there is something that I've learned from the Energiewende in Germany, right, because 20 years ago we did not have data, but today we do have data, right? And if there is something that I've learned from the Energiewende in Germany, that it is actually very risky to build up energy scenarios with technology that do not exist yet, or that they do not exist at industrial scale. And this is actually the mistake that Germany has done, right? And now, okay, the question is, have we learned from that, or do we want to make exactly the same mistake today?
Konrad, I promised that we'd get back to the economic questions, and you've outlined your proposal, and I quote again from your paper, pretty much boiling down to one sentence. You say net zero happens when the creation potential does not or must not exceed the recuperation potential of carbon. Right?
Very, very simple, actually.
And then you make the very hopeful point that this market creates itself in an act of spontaneous order. Beautifully Hayekian, yes, spontaneous order.
Absolutely, Hayekian spontaneous order. Yes, well, because I see it happen actually. I mean, there are already companies who calculate kind of CO2 price to what they are actually producing or using when they do their flights to wherever and so on. And I mean, this is just the start, And there are some companies who try to kind of industrialize absorption of CO2. In Iceland, I think they are based because there's a lot of energy around there. And
Climeworks, you mean?
Climeworks, yeah. So I mean, this is the start, and then of course with the very, very tiny grid of Google Earth, where you can really define everything which is being done on this globe. In a way, this is possible. So it will happen. That's my view. Yes, I'm very optimistic, and I agree. Of course, you should not think of technologies which are not yet in use, but these are technologies which this information and transaction costs are already down. So that's the big hope.
Now, I'd like to give the opportunity to you in the audience to ask questions if you have any. And there is a microphone in the room. We have a question here. The lady in the front. Yes.
Thank you very much for this very interesting conference. Lino, you showed us how huge the problem is. And Annalisa showed you that United Arab Emirates were constructing more than nuclear than we have in Switzerland now within 9 years. Why don't you really promote nuclear now as retired, with your prestige as retired president of the ETH?
Because I have the privilege to enjoy my retirement.
Thank you. I have the next question over there.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for all these enlightening speeches. I must say I was totally shocked by Professor Guzzella's speech and presentation. I wasn't aware the problem is so severe. And I think the time to talk about this is over. We need to act. The other side, who is promoting these erroneous policies is united in a big lobbying effort. And the forces of free markets, they need to unite as well. We need to stand up and do something about it. There's no use in discussing 1 or 2 terawatt here or there. We need to act, and the problem is the political process. All the major parties are captive to a narrative that in its essence is good, but is very badly implemented. And we need to stand up and we need to start to influence the politics to get a reasonable energy transition. And everybody who wants to do that, please talk to me. I'm ready to organize something. Thanks.
Wow.
And I can take one last question. Over. Oh, was there? Okay, we take 2. Over there, and then a short one over there.
He had his hand up a lot.
Thank you. Hans Rentsch. Irene, I would like to remind you that the United Arab Emirates have a different political system than we have. And they never had a Kaiser Augs debacle. I enjoyed very much, of course, the speech or the presentation by Professor Guzzella, but I have a question for you. How do you judge and view the behavior of your former institution in the framework of our Energiewende?
I have always said, and I repeat to say that, there is no such thing as ETH. People always come to me and tell me, but you know, ETH has said this and ETH has said that. This is wrong. ETH consists of 537, if I really count the last number I had, brilliant minds. Annalisa, Manera is one. Others were there. There are some 3,000 doctoral students, postdoc researchers, and everybody of these brilliant people and minds have their opinion. That's good. As long as we all agree upon that we all have the same facts, then I'm fine. You can interpret these facts in this way or the other way. You can have this solution or the other way, so that's fine with me. When you start meddling with the facts, then it's where I'm standing up and say, wait a minute. And this was my talk today. So if somebody's not happy with my facts, then please show me that. If somebody's not happy with my personal conclusions, which I don't share with you because it's my personal thing, then I accept that. So ETH is not, l'ETH n'existe pas. There are 537 people, and some have this opinion, and some have the other opinion. I hope you have your own. And this is the main message that I'm giving to you. Start think yourself. Don't believe anybody, not even me. And come up with your conclusions, and then act. That's what I would recommend to you. Okay? I'm avoiding all political traps today. I'm good.
And I promised you the last question.
Yeah, I just read the latest book of the former president of the Socialist Group, Member of Parliament, Roger Nordmann, and he proposes a new energy climate plan for 2050, which will cost Switzerland 1,000 billion francs, of which would be 429 billion francs of new additional debt for our country. What do these numbers tell about the dreaminess of these plans? Please tell us.
The question is addressed to all of you, but who would like to take it? Maybe Konrad?
Well, I mean, this is just a political statement and we have elections in some weeks, so we have to take this as an additional contribution to whatever. I mean, it's ridiculous, of course. It's ridiculous. I think we have to come back after this election period and to address the real important questions then. Because now it's hopeless, but hopefully people don't just elect these people who have big mouths and not so much behind. But afterwards we have to come to the real issues, and there are many of them, and this energy issue is one, and perhaps the migration issue is another, and the finance and debt issue is the third, and security will be the fourth, something like that.
Now, we had promised Gary to get the last 5 minutes, and we will not renege on that promise. But Jeremy, you had the privilege of being the first speaker. I'll give you the privilege of the last word.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. And it's a little bit about framing some of the issues and the questions that you've had and that I've heard you expressing here. I would like to wholly support what Lino said about trying to grapple with real understanding and building your future on that solid understanding and not fairy tale castles in the air. But I'd also like to add that what is a cost for some is an investment for others. And so we have to be careful about that narrative that runs around about this will cost more. We all know that things grow through investment. So you can think about what are the carrots that come along with that. And coming to your point about the really damaging narratives that have become part of societal discourse in many places, in the UK, in the Netherlands where I live, and clearly here as well. What I would advise from my experience is you do need to address those narratives, but with positive narratives. I find that if you just frame this as some kind of fight and don't recognize the anxieties that are making those narratives popular and address those anxieties, then you're kind of doomed to get into a fight without much light being generated, only heat. And so I do hope you will take this conference and think about the real issues, but also think about the carrots as well as the stick and about those dialogues. Thank you.
The perfect closing statement. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Lino Guzzella, Jeremy Bentham, Konrad Hummler, and Annalisa Manera. Thank you.
Ja, meine Damen und Herren, ich glaube, das Wunschdenken haben wir ein bisschen seziert mit dem realistischen Handeln. Das ist vielleicht noch schwieriger als das Sezieren des Wunschdenkens. Da hapert es noch, aber eben, wir haben ja noch einige Aufgaben vor uns. Und bevor ich Sie jetzt zum Apéro Riche entlasse, folgt mein üblicher kurzer Abgesang. Ich kann und will Ihnen diesen nicht ersparen. Zu diesem Abgesang gehört die Erinnerung daran, dass wir unsere Aktivitäten nicht zuletzt dank Ihrer finanziellen Unterstützung durchführen können. Sollte es unter Ihnen tatsächlich noch einige geben, die diese Unterstützung bisher vergessen haben, kann ich Sie trösten, es ist nie zu spät. Und Neugönner sind uns erst recht willkommen. Die Jahresbeiträge sind seit vielen Jahren gleich moderat, mit 250 Franken für Einzelpersonen, 400 Franken für Paare und 1000 Franken für Firmen sind Sie dabei. Wir gehören also nicht zu den Inflationsgewinnern, aber gegen freiwillige Aufrundungen haben wir natürlich nichts einzuwenden. Jede Unterstützung ist ein Zeichen der Wertschätzung unserer Arbeit. Zu dieser Arbeit gehörte nach der letzten Economic Conference am 20. April mit Charles Goodhart und Ernst Baltensberger zur Frage Are Central Banks Causing Inflation? Ein Anlass im Juni mit dem Think Tank Liberetica und der HSG-Professorin Michelle Sutter-Rüdisser über das Modethema ESG, also Environmental, Social and Corporate Governance. Und die Veranstaltung hat gezeigt, ein bisschen wie hier auch, dass es angesichts vieler guter Absichten und gesellschaftlicher Ansprüche vor Widersprüchen und Zielkonflikten nur so strotzt und dass die meisten Unternehmen sich scheuen, das anzusprechen, weil sie um ihre Reputation bei der Belegschaft, im Markt und in der Öffentlichkeit fürchten. Anfang Juli haben wir den zweiten Denkanstoß links, zeitgeistig und machtverliebt, liberale Gedanken zu den Intellektuellen an unsere Gönner verschickt. Beiträge von Oliver Zimmer, Tito Tetamanti, René Scheu und mir bieten eine Mischung von anspruchsvolleren Texten und leichterer Kost zur Frage, warum die meisten Intellektuellen nicht auf unserer Seite stehen. Dass Emmanuel Garressu unlängst seinen wöchentlichen Blog La Lettre Libérale vollständig diesem Denkanstoß gewidmet hat, freut uns sehr, weil wir damit ein wenig die Sprachgrenze überschreiten. Und ebenso freut uns, dass Konrad Hummler den bereits zitierten Denkanstoß Das Ende der Allmende an der Tagung der Mont Pelerin Society Ende Oktober im geschichtsträchtigen Bretton Woods einem internationalen Publikum präsentieren wird. Sie können diese Denkanstöße von unserer Website herunterladen oder für eine Schutzgebühr von 10 Franken bei uns erwerben. Beim Empfang finden Sie zudem noch weitere Bücher zu Vorzugspreisen. Die 57. Economic Conference wird am 22. Mai 2024 in diesen Räumlichkeiten stattfinden. Der Titel lautet The Rule of Law Under Pressure. Als Referenten konnten wir Paul Kirchhoff gewinnen, Professor Emeritus für Staatsrecht der Universität Heidelberg, einer breiteren Öffentlichkeit, aber vor allem bekannt von 12 Jahren als Richter des Bundesverfassungsgerichts und als steuerpolitischer Kopf im Kompetenzteam von Angela Merkel im Bundestagswahlkampf 2005. Nachdem es dann zu einer großen Koalition kam, stand er als Finanzminister nicht zur Verfügung. Aus den USA wird Professor Tom Ginsburg anreisen, Professor für internationales Recht und Politikwissenschaft an der University of Chicago und einer der meistzitierten Völkerrechtler der USA. Tragen Sie also das Datum schon jetzt ein. Wir werden Sie rechtzeitig schriftlich einladen, zuerst Gönner und Förderer, dann, sofern noch Plätze frei sind, weitere Personen auf unserer Adressliste. Und schließlich bleibt mir zu danken den Referenten und Podiumsteilnehmern, dem Moderator, den Kräften im Hintergrund, Carina Albin und Ida Waltensbühl, ohne die der Anlass nicht stattfinden könnte, dem Team des Zunfthauses, der Technik und natürlich vor allem Ihnen allen für Ihr Interesse an unserer Arbeit. Bleiben Sie uns gewogen, nutzen Sie jetzt den informellen Teil einen Stock tiefer für anregende Gespräche und kommen Sie danach gut zurück an die Arbeit oder nach Hause. Einen guten.